When World War III starts, most people won't die from bombs. They won't die from soldiers. They won't die from gunfire. They'll die quietly, from cold, from exposure, from waiting too long to act. Modern life hides how fragile the human body really is. We live indoors, surrounded by temperature control, walls, and routines that never change. That comfort creates a dangerous illusion that shelter is optional or that it can be solved later. But collapse doesn't give warnings. When systems fail, shelter stops being a background feature of life and becomes the difference between continuing and ending. Not comfort, not safety, just continuation. The human body can endure hunger for weeks. It can endure thirst for days. But exposure kills fast. Wind pulls heat from the body relentlessly. Moisture accelerates heat loss. The ground drains warmth silently, and once your core temperature begins to drop, decision-making degrades before pain even registers. That's why shelter always comes first. Not because it feels important, but because it works quietly in the background while everything else falls apart. This is where most people make their first mistake. They wait. They wait for clarity. They wait for daylight. They wait for better options. They assume something more permanent will appear if they just hold on a little longer. But waiting is a luxury that disappears early in collapse. WW3 doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives with confusion, with outages, with broken routines, with long stretches of nothing happening, until suddenly something does. And in those early hours, shelter isn't about building a home. It's about buying time. Time to think. Time to observe. Time to survive the first night. Most people imagine shelter as something solid and finished. Walls, roofs, doors. But in reality, shelter is a temporary interruption between you and exposure. Anything that slows heat loss. Anything that blocks wind. Anything that separates you from the ground. That's it. Shelter is not a destination. It's a pause. And when panic spreads, pauses become rare. People freeze because they think shelter requires tools, materials, or skill. They convince themselves they're unprepared, so they delay action. That delay feels safer than doing something imperfect. But imperfect shelter beats perfect plans that never happen. The moment WW3 starts, the environment becomes hostile by default. Weather doesn't care about politics. Cold doesn't care about intent. Exposure doesn't wait for permission. The people who survive aren't the ones with the best gear. They're the ones who understand this truth early. Shelter is not about building. It's about stopping loss, stopping heat loss, stopping energy loss, stopping time from working against you. Once you grasp that, the idea of needing tools disappears. Because when survival becomes the priority, the question changes from what can I build to what can I block? And that shift, early, calm, and decisive, is what separates the people who make it through the first nights from the ones who never do. When WW3 starts, danger doesn't immediately look like danger. There's no clear signal, no countdown, no moment where everyone agrees something has changed. Instead, there's uncertainty, conflicting information, partial outages, rumors mixed with normalcy. And in uncertainty, the human brain doesn't move forward. It freezes. Freezing is not cowardice, it's biology. When the brain can't clearly identify the best option, it delays action in hopes that clarity will arrive. This response evolved to protect us, but during collapse, it becomes lethal. Most people don't fail because they panic. They fail because they wait. They wait for confirmation that things are really bad. They wait for instructions. They wait for someone else to act first. And while they wait, exposure begins working quietly. Cold doesn't announce itself. Wind doesn't escalate suddenly. Fatigue accumulates invisibly. By the time danger feels obvious, the window for easy action is already closed. This is where the idea of zero tools becomes critical. People freeze because they believe shelter requires preparation, materials, equipment, skill. They tell themselves they can't act yet because they're missing something essential. That belief creates paralysis. The brain treats incomplete preparation as a reason to do nothing at all, and doing nothing feels safer than doing something wrong, especially when stress is high. But survival doesn't reward hesitation. In every collapse scenario, natural disasters, wars, blackouts, the people who survive early stages aren't the most prepared. They're the ones who act before certainty. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They don't wait for permission. They don't wait for instructions. They move with incomplete information and accept imperfect solutions. Most people can't do that. Modern life trains us to rely on systems, to follow procedures, to wait for guidance. When those systems disappear, the mind doesn't immediately adapt. It stalls, and stalling feels rational. Let's see what happens. Let's wait until morning. Let's not overreact. Those thoughts feel calm, reasonable, responsible. They're also deadly, because collapse punishes delay more than mistakes. A poorly chosen shelter is survivable. No shelter at all is not. Freezing also happens because people misjudge time. They assume they have more of it than they do. They underestimate how fast fatigue, cold, and stress degrade decision-making. By the time the body demands action, the mind is already compromised. That's why early shelter matters more than good shelter. Action breaks the freeze response. Once someone takes even a small step, blocking wind, reducing exposure, creating separation from the ground, the brain regains momentum. Fear decreases. Clarity improves. Options expand. But the first step is always the hardest. This chapter exists for one reason: to make sure you don't wait. Because when WW3 starts, the most dangerous place you can be isn't outside. It's inside your own hesitation. When people hear zero tools, they imagine helplessness. No gear, no equipment, no preparation. They picture vulnerability. But zero tools doesn't mean zero capability. It means zero dependence. Modern life trains us to believe that survival is something you buy. Tools, equipment, systems, products. When those things disappear, people assume survival disappears with them. That belief is the real danger. Zero tools means stripping survival back to its most basic function. Interrupting exposure. Nothing more. Nothing fancy. Shelter is not a construction project. It's a decision to stop letting the environment drain you. The mistake most people make is thinking shelter starts with building. It doesn't. It starts with blocking. Blocking wind. Blocking moisture. Blocking contact with the ground. Those three things remove more danger than any tool ever will. The idea of tools becomes a psychological crutch. People tell themselves they'll act once they have the right item, the right setup, the right plan. That belief delays action and increases risk. Zero tools removes that excuse. It forces the mind to focus on function instead of form. You're not building a structure, you're creating separation. Separation between your body and the elements. Separation between heat and loss. Separation between exhaustion and recovery. This is how humans survived for tens of thousands of years, long before tools were standardized, branded, or reliable. Shelter came first because it had to, not because it was comfortable, but because it worked. Zero tools also changes how you think about time. Tools encourage permanence. They make people settle in, commit, invest effort into long-term solutions. But early collapse is not about permanence. It's about buying hours. hours to think clearly, hours to observe what's happening, hours to let panic burn itself out elsewhere. Shelter in this phase is temporary by design. The moment you think of it as a home, you lose flexibility. Zero tools shelter is disposable, forgettable, easy to abandon without regret. That mindset keeps you mobile. Another misunderstanding is skill. People assume they lack the knowledge to survive without tools. But survival knowledge isn't complex. It's instinctive. It's been buried under comfort, not erased. Your body already knows what cold feels like. It knows what wind does. It knows when the ground is draining heat. Zero tools means listening to those signals instead of ignoring them. The most dangerous thing during WW3 isn't being unprepared. It's being overly attached to preparation. People with gear hesitate because they don't want to waste it. People without gear act faster because they have nothing to protect but themselves. That speed matters. Zero tools doesn't mean reckless. It means responsive. It means understanding that shelter is not something you perfect. It's something you create now, with what's available, and adjust later. Once you internalize that, survival stops feeling technical. It becomes simple, not easy, not comfortable, just simple. And in the early hours of WW3, simplicity is what keeps you alive. When WW3 begins, shelter doesn't fail because people don't try. It fails because they try to do too much, too late, in the wrong way. Across wars, disasters, and collapses, the same three shelter mistakes repeat. Different countries, different climates, same outcomes. The first mistake is waiting for better conditions. People tell themselves they'll act when it's lighter, warmer, calmer, or clearer. They convince themselves the situation will stabilize if they just hold on a little longer. This feels reasonable. It feels controlled. It's also how exposure wins. The environment doesn't pause for your timing. Wind doesn't soften because you're unsure. Cold doesn't negotiate. Every minute without shelter drains energy you can't afford to lose. Waiting isn't neutral. It's a decision. And in collapse, it's usually the wrong one. The second mistake is overbuilding. People assume shelter must look complete to work. Walls, shape, symmetry. Something recognizable as a structure. They invest time and energy into appearance instead of function. That focus is dangerous. Shelter doesn't need to look right. It needs to interrupt loss, heat loss, energy loss, moisture loss. Anything beyond that is secondary. Overbuilding burns calories, increases fatigue, and delays protection. Worse, it creates emotional attachment. Once someone invests heavily, they hesitate to leave, even when conditions change. Collapse punishes attachment. Shelter is a pause, not a commitment. The third mistake is choosing visibility over safety. Under stress, people gravitate toward obvious places, open areas, landmarks, locations that feel logical. These choices are driven by familiarity, not survivability. Visibility feels reassuring. It feels like help might arrive, like someone will notice. But in the early stages of WW3, visibility is a liability. Visible shelters attract attention, curiosity, and movement. Even without hostile intent, people drift toward what they can see. That drift becomes pressure. Pressure creates risk. A shelter that feels obvious rarely stays private. These three mistakes share a single cause: misunderstanding the purpose of shelter. Shelter is not about comfort. It's not about permanence. And it's not about being found. It's about reducing exposure long enough for the body and mind to recover. The people who survive early collapse aren't the ones who build the best shelters. They're the ones who avoid these mistakes. They act early instead of waiting. They block instead of building. They choose obscurity instead of visibility. None of that requires tools. It requires restraint. Restraint from waiting for certainty. Restraint from overcommitting. Restraint from choosing places that feel safe instead of places that are safe. This chapter isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to simplify your decisions when everything feels complex. Because when WW3 starts, you won't have time to learn these lessons the hard way. Avoid these 3 mistakes and you avoid the fastest paths to failure. Everything else can be adjusted later. Survival can't. Most people imagine shelter as something you build. In reality, shelter is something you remove. You remove wind. You remove moisture. You remove contact with the ground. Everything else is secondary. When WW3 starts, survivable shelter isn't defined by how it looks, how solid it feels, or how long it lasts. It's defined by how effectively it slows loss. Loss of heat, loss of energy, loss of clarity. That's the frame most people miss. A survivable shelter does 4 things, nothing more. First, it reduces wind. Wind is invisible theft. It strips heat constantly, even when temperatures don't feel extreme. You don't notice it at first. You just feel more tired, slower, less focused. By the time cold feels obvious, damage is already happening. Shelter that interrupts airflow buys immediate relief. Second, it separates you from the ground. The ground drains warmth relentlessly. It doesn't matter if the air feels manageable. Direct contact pulls heat away faster than most people expect. This is one of the fastest ways exposure turns dangerous. A survivable shelter always creates separation, even minimal separation, because it stops that constant drain. Third, it retains heat, not by generating it, but by preventing it from escaping. This is where people overthink. They assume warmth comes from effort or activity. In reality, warmth comes from conservation. The body produces heat naturally. Shelter's job is to keep it from leaving. Retention beats production every time. Fourth, it limits visibility. Not just visual visibility, but presence, movement, noise, pattern. A shelter that works physically but advertises itself socially creates a different kind of risk. Attention introduces variables you can't control. Curiosity, interaction, pressure. A survivable shelter does its job quietly. What's important is what this list does not include. It doesn't include permanence. It doesn't include comfort. It doesn't include durability. Survivable shelter is not a home. It's not an investment. It's not something you defend. It's a pause button. This is why complexity works against survival in the early phase. Complexity takes time. Time costs energy. Energy loss compounds every other problem. Simple shelter can be created quickly, adjusted easily, and abandoned without hesitation. That flexibility is survival. People who get into trouble aren't missing materials. They're missing restraint. They add features instead of stopping losses. They chase improvement instead of accepting good enough. But good enough is exactly what keeps you alive through the first nights. Shelter doesn't need to solve the future. It only needs to solve now. Once the body stabilizes, the mind clears. Once the mind clears, options expand. And once options exist, survival stops being reactive. That's the real purpose of shelter. Not to protect you forever, just long enough for you to think. And when WW3 starts, the people who understand that early, who strip shelter down to its essential function, are the ones who make it through the phase that kills everyone else. Because survivable shelter isn't impressive, it's effective, and effectiveness is quiet. When people think about shelter, they think about protection, walls, cover, something solid enough to feel safe. But during the opening phase of WW3, Safety doesn't come from comfort or strength. It comes from not being noticed. Invisibility isn't about hiding perfectly. It's about avoiding attention long enough for danger to move elsewhere. And attention, once drawn, rarely leaves without consequences. Comfort creates signals. Light, noise, movement, routine. Each one tells the outside world that someone is there, that something is happening, that resources, warmth, or stability might exist behind those walls. In a collapsed environment, those signals don't mean safe, they mean interesting. People under stress gravitate toward anything that breaks the background, not because they want conflict, but because uncertainty drives curiosity, and curiosity creates interaction. Interaction is risk. This is where most people fail. They build shelters that feel good, to be inside, but loud to the outside world. They focus on staying warm while forgetting they're becoming visible. And visibility attracts variables you can't control. A comfortable shelter encourages staying put. It encourages routine. It encourages habits. And habits are patterns. And patterns are easy to notice. Invisibility, on the other hand, requires restraint. It means accepting discomfort in exchange for privacy. It means choosing quiet over convenience. It means understanding that temporary hardship is safer than long-term attention. The safest shelters aren't the warmest or the driest. They're the ones no one remembers seeing. Invisibility also buys psychological safety. When you know you're not being observed, the mind relaxes. Stress drops. Decisions improve. Panic loses its grip. That mental clarity matters as much as physical shelter. Comfort without invisibility creates a trap. Once attention finds you, you can't undo it. People remember locations. They share information. They return. And with each return, the risk escalates. This is why early survival isn't about fortifying. It's about fading. You don't want to look established. You don't want to look successful. You don't want to look like you figured things out. You want to look forgettable. In collapse, forgettable is protection. This doesn't mean fear. It means awareness. It means recognizing that humans under pressure become drawn to certainty, and anything that looks stable becomes a magnet. Invisibility breaks that pull. Shelter that doesn't advertise itself doesn't get evaluated. Shelter that doesn't get evaluated doesn't get tested. Shelter that doesn't get tested doesn't fail. That's the chain. Comfort solves internal problems. Invisibility solves external ones. And external problems are the ones that escalate beyond your control. When WW3 starts, the goal isn't to create a place you love being in. It's to create a place the world ignores. And the people who understand that, early, calmly, without panic, are the ones who survive long enough for conditions to change. Because in the first phase of collapse, comfort can be replaced. Attention cannot.